This is a private, controlled burn on private property, ma'am. You're trespassing, and I need you to remove yourself and your golf cart immediately." I kept my voice as flat and steady as the horizon, a trick you learn in 30 years of military service, where showing emotion is a liability you can't afford. The woman in front of me, however, was a walking, talking, fuming liability. She was a plus-size woman of about 50, squeezed into a pastel pink polo shirt with a Whispering Pines Estates logo embroidered over the pocket. Her face a mask of incandescent rage that clashed violently with the serene green of my burgeoning forest. Her name, as I would soon learn with the force of a legal summons, was Karen. She jabbed a finger, tipped with a French manicure that looked dangerously sharp, not at me, but at the neat line of creeping fire I was managing with a flapper and a water tank. "I don't care if it's the surface of the moon," she screeched, the sound grating against the peaceful crackle of the flames. "That smoke is blowing towards my residents' homes. It's a nuisance, it's a hazard, and it is a clear violation of Whispering Pines, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Section 7, subsection B, regarding unapproved landscaping and atmospheric pollutants." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I took a half step forward, making sure my 6'2" frame cast a long shadow over her and her ridiculous chariot. "Ma'am, for the last time, your covenants mean less than nothing out here. This is the Blackwood Timber Tract, 500 acres of it. It is not, nor has it ever been, part of your subdivision. Now get off my land." She puffed out her chest, a bulldog preparing for a fight it couldn't possibly win. "I am the president of the Homeowners Association," she announced, as if that title granted her dominion over the entire county. "I have a fiduciary duty to protect the property values of my community, and your wilderness," she spat the word like it was poison, "is a direct threat to that. I will be issuing a fine, a significant one. And if I see this fire again, I'll have the sheriff's department out here to arrest you for reckless endangerment." She threw her golf cart into reverse with a furious jerk, the electric motor whining in protest as she spun around, kicking up a spray of dirt and pine needles that landed on my boots. As she sped away toward the invisible line separating my world from hers, she yelled one last thing over her shoulder, a promise that dripped with malicious intent. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, mister. I run this place." I stood there for a long moment, the scent of pine and controlled fire filling my lungs, a scent of renewal and forest health that she had called a pollutant. I watched her pink shirt disappear behind a stand of perfectly manicured Bradford pear trees that marked the edge of her kingdom. I had a feeling she was right about one thing. I didn't know who I was dealing with, but she had made an even bigger mistake. She had no idea who she was dealing with either. This was just the opening shot in a war I never wanted to fight, but one I was damn sure going to win. If you've ever had a run-in with a power-tripping HOA board member who thinks their little rule book is the law of the land, hit that subscribe button right now because you're going to want to see how this ends. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what your own HOA nightmare story is. You are not alone. Now let me tell you how a single piece of paper became my Declaration of Independence. My name is Jack Sterling, Colonel, retired U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. For 30 years, my life was about structure, discipline, and building things meant to last, often in places that were actively trying to tear them down. When I retired, I wanted the exact opposite of that high-stress, high-stakes world. I wanted peace. I wanted space. I wanted land. I found it in the form of a 500-acre tract of longleaf pine forest that had been owned by the same family for a century. It was my slice of heaven, a living, breathing ecosystem that I planned to manage not as a developer, but as a steward. My plan was simple: sustainable timber harvesting, restoring the native wiregrass ecosystem through prescribed burns, and leaving a legacy of healthy forest for whatever came after me. The land was bordered on one side by a state highway, on two sides by other large timber tracts, and on the fourth, eastern side, by the brand new, impeccably landscaped development of Whispering Pines Estates. When I bought the property, my lawyer was crystal clear. The plat maps, the deeds, the county records, they all showed my 500 acres as a completely separate, unencumbered parcel. It was explicitly, legally, and geographically excluded from the land that was eventually developed into Whispering Pines. For the first year, things were quiet. I spent my days clearing underbrush, marking trees, and planning my first controlled burn, a critical tool for managing southern pine forests. I'd wave at the occasional resident jogging on the road that ran parallel to my property line, 100 yards away. They'd wave back. It was all very neighborly. I was a quiet man on a quiet piece of land. I assumed the people in the fancy houses with their identical mailboxes and perfectly edged lawns were the same. I was wrong. The confrontation with Karen at the burn line was the first tremor. The earthquake arrived in my mailbox 3 days later. It was a crisp, cream-colored envelope with the Whispering Pines Estates logo embossed in gold. Inside was a letter, printed on heavy bond paper, that felt more like a legal threat than a notice. It was from the Architectural Review Committee, but it was signed with a flourish that screamed self-importance by Karen Miller, President, Whispering Pines HOA. The letter formally cited me for 3 violations. First, unapproved landscaping activity, referencing the controlled burn. Second, creation of a public nuisance, referencing the smoke. Third, and this was the one that made my blood run cold with its sheer audacity, failure to maintain property in accordance with community-wide standards of aesthetic appeal. My 500 acres of natural forest, it seemed, was not aesthetically appealing to Karen. Attached to the letter was an invoice, a fine of $500 for the first violation, $250 for the second, and another $500 for the third. A total of $1,250, with a note at the bottom stating that fines would double for every 30 days they went unpaid. My first reaction was to laugh. It was absurd, like getting a speeding ticket from a toddler on a tricycle. But the laughter died in my throat as I reread the letter. The tone wasn't just mistaken, it was predatory. It was the language of a bully who had gotten away with it 100 times before. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a calculated act of aggression, an attempt to annex my land, my rights, and my life into her petty fiefdom. I walked into my office, the letter clutched in my hand. On the wall hung my framed commission, my retirement certificate, and a photo of a bridge my unit built over a raging river in some godforsaken corner of the world. We built it under fire, with half the resources we needed, because that was the mission. We didn't back down. I looked from those memories to the ridiculous piece of paper in my hand. Karen Miller had just given me a new mission. I took out a fresh binder, one of the heavy-duty 3-ring types I'd used for operational planning. On the spine, I wrote in black marker, Operation Whispering Pines. I 3-hole punched Karen's letter and the invoice and snapped them into place. This wasn't about a fire anymore. This wasn't about smoke. This was about a fundamental principle. A person's rights don't end where an HOA's delusions of grandeur begin. I was going to teach Karen Miller a very detailed, very permanent lesson about jurisdiction, property law, and the quiet resolve of a man who has nothing but time and the truth on his side. The war had begun. The initial salvo of $1,250 was just the beginning of Karen's paper-based assault. Within 2 weeks, another cream-colored envelope appeared in my mailbox. This one contained a photograph, clearly taken from the road with a telephoto lens, of a pile of deadfall and underbrush I had cleared to create a firebreak. The accompanying letter cited me for improper storage of landscape debris and added another $300 fine. It was signed with the same arrogant flourish. I calmly took the letter, 3-hole punched it, and placed it in my Operation Whispering Pines binder behind the first one. I was a strategist by training. The first step in any conflict is to understand your enemy's tactics. Karen's were clear: harassment by 1,000 paper cuts. She believed she could bury me in fines, bog me down in bureaucracy, and bully me into submission. She was treating this like a war of attrition, assuming my resources or my will would crumble before hers. It was a foolish assumption. My pension was more than enough to live on, and my will had been forged in far hotter fires than a suburban HOA dispute. A week later, another letter. This time, the violation was visual pollution, unkempt tree line. Apparently, the natural, wild edge of my forest, where pines of varying heights grew as nature intended, offended her sensibilities. The identical lollipop-shaped trees of her subdivision were the community-wide standard. Another $500 fine. I added it to the binder. The total was now over $2,000. The humor of the situation was long gone, replaced by a cold, methodical anger. This woman was attempting to extort money from me for the crime of owning land that wasn't covered in chemically treated, perfectly uniform sod. She was weaponizing aesthetics, turning subjective taste into a cudgel to beat me with. It was then that she made her next move, escalating from paper to direct intervention. I received a phone call from a Mr. Henderson at the County Code Enforcement Office. His voice was thick with boredom. "Yes, Mr. Sterling, I'm calling about a complaint we received regarding a potential fire hazard on your property," he droned. "Something about excessive accumulation of combustible materials?" I could almost hear him rolling his eyes over the phone. "Let me guess," I said, my voice calm. "The complaint came from a Ms. Karen Miller, president of the Whispering Pines HOA. There was a pause, then the sound of shuffling papers. Yes, it did," he admitted, a hint of weary recognition in his tone. "She's, a frequent flyer with our office." "I'm sure she is," I replied. "Mr. Henderson, I'm a retired Army Corps of Engineers colonel. I've spent a significant portion of my career managing large-scale land projects, including fire mitigation. The combustible materials she's referring to are part of a professionally planned forest management program. I'd be happy to email you my written burn plan, which has already been filed with the State Forestry Commission, as well as the certifications I hold in wildland firefighting." Another pause, longer this time. "You're certified?" he asked, the boredom in his voice replaced by a spark of interest. That would be excellent. Please do. Honestly, Mr. Sterling, her complaint alleged your property was an imminent threat to public safety. Your plan will be more than enough to close this out." I thanked him, sent the documents, and received an email back within the hour. "Case closed," it read. "Thank you for your professionalism." I printed the entire email chain and added it to the binder. This was a crucial piece of evidence. Karen hadn't just harassed me. She had filed a false report with a government agency. She was wasting taxpayer resources in her personal vendetta. The binder was getting thicker. It was no longer just a collection of absurd fines. It was becoming a dossier, a detailed record of a campaign of escalating harassment. Each letter, each call, each threat was a self-inflicted wound she didn't even know she was creating. I spent that evening online, downloading the publicly available covenants, conditions, and restrictions, C, and Rs, for Whispering Pines. I read all 120 pages of them. It was a masterpiece of petty tyranny, with rules governing everything from the approved species of mailbox flowers to the maximum allowable duration a garage door could remain open, 15 minutes. But deep within the legalese, I found what I was looking for. The section on the HOA's jurisdiction. It was defined by a precise plat map reference number filed with the county. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. For a nominal fee, I got a high-resolution, certified copy of that exact plat map. There it was, in crisp black and white, an undeniable legal fact. The boundary of Whispering Pines Estate stopped dead at a thick, solid line. On the other side of that line, my property was clearly labeled, Blackwood Timber Tract, not a part of this plat. I had the cartographer's office print me a large, poster-sized version. This was my shield. This was my sword. Karen could send all the letters she wanted. She could invent fines out of thin air, but she couldn't argue with the legally binding document that defined the limits of her tiny kingdom. I drove home, the rolled-up map on the seat beside me. I felt a grim satisfaction. She thought this was a battle of wills. I was turning it into a battle of facts, and she had just handed me all the ammunition I would ever need. The fines had now reached a comical $2,850, but they were no longer just annoyances. They were exhibits in the case I was building against her. Each one was a nail she was hammering into her own coffin. Karen's failure to weaponize the county against me seemed only to embolden her. If official channels wouldn't bend to her will, she would simply invent her own authority. This led to her most audacious move yet, a gambit so arrogant it shifted my entire strategy from defense to a full-scale counteroffensive. It began with a strange truck parked on the public road bordering my property. It was a commercial surveyor's vehicle. I watched from a distance as two men in bright orange vests got out, unloaded their equipment, and began sighting a line that ran from the road, across the drainage ditch, and directly onto my land. They were following the path of an old overgrown trail, barely visible, that had likely been used for logging decades before the Whispering Pines development was even a glimmer in a contractor's eye. I let them work for about an hour, observing their movements through a pair of binoculars from the cover of the woods. They were methodical, driving stakes into the ground and marking them with pink flagging tape. My land. They were marking my land. After I had seen enough, I got in my truck and drove out to the road, parking behind their vehicle. I got out and walked towards them, my boots making a soft crunching sound on the gravel shoulder. I kept my hands visible and my demeanor non-threatening. "Morning, gentlemen," I said, my voice even. "Can I help you?" The older of the two, a man with a sun-beaten face, looked up from his transit. "Just doing a survey, sir." "I can see that," I replied. "Thing is, you're on private property. This is the Blackwood Timber Tract." He nodded, unfazed. "We know. We've been contracted by the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association to survey and mark a historical community access easement." My blood ran cold, but I didn't let it show on my face. A community access easement. It was a legal fiction, a complete fabrication, but a dangerous one. If she could somehow legitimize this claim, she could establish a permanent foothold on my property, allowing HOA residents to traipse through my timberland at will. It would destroy my privacy, compromise my forest management operations, and be an eternal thorn in my side. "There is no community access easement on this property," I stated, the words coming out as hard and sharp as chips of granite. "This is a private timber tract, and that trail is a defunct logging road." The surveyor shrugged, clearly not paid enough to argue. He pulled a folded work order from his vest pocket. "Look, sir, I'm just doing the job I was paid for. Work order says to survey and stake the trail from the road to the eastern clearing. It's signed by the HOA president." "May I see that?" I asked. He hesitated for a second, then handed it to me. There it was in black and white, a work order from Precision Surveying Incorporated for the Whispering Pines HOA. The scope of work was exactly as he described. And at the bottom, the authorization signature, Karen Miller. I pulled out my phone. "You don't mind if I take a picture of this, do you? For my records." The surveyor, now looking distinctly uncomfortable, just wanted to be done with it. "Go ahead." I took several clear, high-resolution photos of the work order, making sure Karen's signature was perfectly legible. Then I handed it back. "All right," I said, changing my tone. "I appreciate you're just doing your job, but I'm now formally notifying you that you are trespassing. There is no legal easement. Your client has misled you. I want you to pack up your equipment and leave my property immediately." The younger man looked nervous, but the older one had seen this kind of dispute before. "We've been contracted," he started again. "Your contract is with the HOA, not with me," I cut him off. "And their authority ends at that ditch. If you or your equipment are still on my side of that line in 15 minutes, the next person you'll be talking to is a sheriff's deputy. I will have you cited for criminal trespass." My voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. It was the voice I used when a junior officer was about to make a catastrophic mistake. It worked. The older surveyor looked from me to my truck, then back at his stakes and pink ribbons disappearing into my woods. He sighed. "All right, kid, pack it up. It's not worth the headache." Within 10 minutes, they had removed every stake, every ribbon, and loaded all their equipment back into their truck. The older man gave me a curt nod before getting in. "You'll need to take it up with the HOA, sir." "Oh, I will," I said, the words hanging in the air as they drove away. "I most certainly will." I went back to my office and printed the photos of the work order. They went into the binder along with a detailed time-stamped narrative of the entire encounter. This was a quantum leap in the conflict. Karen was now spending HOA money, the dues of her residents, to fund her illegal campaign against me. She had hired a contractor to physically invade and alter my property under a completely false legal pretext. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense property attorney named Ben Carter, who I had consulted when I first bought the land. I explained the situation, From the first fine to the surveyors. Ben was silent for a moment after I finished. Then he let out a low whistle. Wow, Jack. This isn't just a rogue HOA president. This is actionable. Malicious trespass, attempted conversion of property, not to mention the financial implications for the HOA itself. So what's our move? I asked. Do we send a cease and desist? Sue her? Ben's response was what solidified my respect for him. No, he said slowly, the gears clearly turning in his mind. We wait. A cease and desist will just make her lawyer up and get cagey. Right now, she's arrogant. She thinks she's untouchable. Let her keep going. Let her spend more HOA money. Let her dig this hole so deep she can't see the sky. Document everything. Every letter, every phone call, every dime she spends trying to mess with you. We're not going to win this in a letter. We're going to win this in a public forum, in front of the very people whose money she's burning. Just keep building your case, Colonel. Let her hang herself with her own rope. It was brilliant, disciplined advice. It appealed to the strategist in me. This wasn't a skirmish to be won quickly. This was a siege, and I had all the time in the world. The incident with the surveyors marked a critical turning point. It was no longer enough to simply defend my own property. I realized that to truly end this, I needed to dismantle the power structure that enabled Karen's tyranny. To do that, I needed allies from within her own kingdom. My first move was to identify other victims. I started spending a little time each afternoon near the entrance of the subdivision, not on my property, but on the public road, ostensibly checking my fence line. I was observing, listening. I was looking for the telltale signs of an oppressed populace. I didn't have to wait long. I saw a young couple, the Millers, standing in their driveway, arguing with a man in another Whispering Pines polo shirt. He was holding a clipboard and pointing at their house. I saw the woman's shoulders slump into defeat as he handed her a piece of paper and drove off in a golf cart. I waited a day, then drove to the local hardware store on a Saturday morning, guessing they might need to buy paint. I found the husband, Mark, staring blankly at a wall of beige color swatches. Tough choice, isn't it? I said, walking up beside him. He gave a short, bitter laugh. You have no idea. We just got fined $200 because our shutters are desert sand instead of the approved Tuscan Acre. They look exactly the same to me. Let me guess, I said. A fine from Karen Miller's Architectural Review Committee? Mark's head snapped around. How did you know? I'm your neighbor, I said, extending a hand. Jack Sterling. I own the timberland next door. I've been receiving my own set of fines from Ms. Miller. A look of dawning comprehension, then solidarity crossed his face. You're the guy with the forest. She's been complaining about you in the HOA newsletter. Calls your property the blighted zone. I'm flattered, I said dryly. Listen, Mark, I'm building a case against her for overstepping her authority, for harassment, for misusing HOA funds. Would you and your wife be willing to talk to me? Everything would be confidential. For now. He didn't even hesitate. When and where? We're so tired of this. We got fined last month because our son left his tricycle on the porch overnight. We met that evening at a coffee shop in the next town over. Mark and his wife, Jessica, poured out 2 years of accumulated frustration. Fines for their grass being a 1/4 inch too high. A warning for having a non-approved welcome mat. A demand that they remove a small vegetable garden from their backyard because it was not in keeping with the community's ornamental aesthetic. They showed me a stack of violation notices nearly an inch thick. I photographed every single one for my records. They were Exhibit B. My next target was the house with the American flag. It was a modest home, but the flagpole was immaculate, the flag itself perfectly lit at night. I'd heard through Mark that the owner was a veteran who had been in a long-running battle with Karen over the flagpole's height. I waited until I saw him outside doing yard work one afternoon. He was a man in his late 60s with a wiry frame and a Marine Corps tattoo faded on his forearm. His name was Dave. That's a fine-looking flag, I said by way of introduction. He eyed me warily. Thanks. Jack Sterling, I said, offering a hand. Army, retired. His posture changed instantly. The wariness was replaced by the easy camaraderie of fellow servicemen. Dave Jensen, Marines. Good to meet you, Colonel. Just Jack, I said. I'm your neighbor to the west. I wanted to ask you about that flagpole. A little bird told me our mutual friend Karen Miller has a problem with it. Dave let out a snort. Problem? She's been fining me $50 a month for 2 years because it's 25 feet tall and her rules say they can only be 20. I told her the Federal Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005 supersedes her petty regulations. She told me her regulations supersede federal law. Sent me a letter from the HOA lawyer to back it up. I'd love to see that letter, I said, my voice tight. The idea that an HOA lawyer would put such a patently false legal claim in writing was gold. Dave invited me inside. His home was neat, filled with service memorabilia. He produced a folder, his own smaller version of my binder. And there it was, a letter from the HOA's legal firm, a small local outfit, stating that while the federal act did exist, the HOA's rules on placement and height were reasonable restrictions and were fully enforceable. It was a weak, easily dismantled argument, but to a layman, it looked intimidating. She's banking on people not having the money or the will to fight her lawyer, I said, taking a photo of the letter. Exactly, Dave said. It would cost me $5,000 to get a lawyer to fight this. It's cheaper to just pay the $50 a month. It's extortion is what it is. Dave, I said, looking him in the eye, I am fighting her, and I'm not sending letters. I'm building a case to have her and her entire board removed at the annual meeting. I have evidence of her spending HOA funds to harass me on my own private land, which is not part of the HOA. I have the Miller's testimony. With your story and that letter, we can show a pattern of abuse and illegal overreach. Will you join me? A slow grin spread across Dave's face. Colonel, Jack, I've been waiting for this day for 2 years. Tell me the plan. I'm in. The alliance was forming. The quiet, resentful residents were starting to find a voice. But I knew that to truly cripple Karen's regime, I needed to hit her where she was most vulnerable and most proud, the HOA's finances. I needed a source on the inside. Mark Miller mentioned a woman who had served as the HOA treasurer for a year before quitting in disgust after repeated clashes with Karen. Her name was Sarah, a retired CPA. She was quiet, kept to herself, and, according to Mark, hated Karen with the fire of 1,000 suns. Sarah was my next target. She would be the key to unlocking the castle treasury. Finding Sarah was easy. Getting her to talk was the challenge. She lived in a meticulously kept home at the back of the subdivision, one that had 0 visible violations, a clear sign of someone who knew the rules and followed them to the letter just to be left alone. She was, as Mark had described, intensely private. My first 2 attempts to approach her were met with polite but firm deflections. She didn't want to get involved. She had her peace and she intended to keep it. I knew a direct assault wouldn't work. I needed to present this not as a request for help, but as a shared mission with a clear and achievable objective. I changed tactics. I compiled a summary of my findings so far. The illegal fines against my non-HOA property, the photo of the surveyor's work order with Karen's signature, the letter from the HOA lawyer making a bogus claim about federal law to Dave, and a sampling of the petty fines against the Millers. I put it all in a neat folder, and, with Ben Carter's blessing, I drafted a cover letter. It didn't ask for anything. It simply stated the facts and outlined my intention: to present a motion for the removal of the board at the upcoming annual meeting based on malfeasance, misuse of funds, and consistent violation of the HOA's own governing documents. I left the folder on her doorstep with a simple, handwritten note. Sarah, I believe you are a person of integrity. What is happening here is wrong. If you agree, you know how to find me. Jack Sterling. I didn't hear anything for 2 days. I was beginning to think I had miscalculated. Then on the 3rd evening, my phone rang. It was an unlisted number. Mr. Sterling, a crisp professional voice said, this is Sarah Gable. I've reviewed your documents. Your assessment is not only correct, it's understated. Meet me tomorrow at the public library, 10 a.m. Come alone. Bring a flash drive. When I met her, Sarah was all business. She was a woman in her early 60s with sharp eyes and an air of quiet competence. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Karen runs the HOA's finances like a personal slush fund, she began, her voice low. I was treasurer for 1 year. I tried to implement standard accounting controls, dual signatures on checks over a certain amount, mandatory board approval for non-budgeted expenses, clear audit trails. She fought me at every turn. She accused me of trying to obstruct progress and create unnecessary bureaucracy. What she meant was I was trying to stop her from spending money without oversight. Sarah slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a list of account numbers and passwords. This is for the HOA's online banking portal and their accounting software. They never change the passwords after I resign. Incompetence is sometimes an asset. My eyebrows shot up. This was the motherlode. When I was treasurer, she continued, Karen created a budget line item called Community Enhancement and Landscaping Contingency. It was a huge pot of money, around $50,000 a year. It was supposed to be for things like planting new trees at the entrance or repairing winter storm damage. In reality, it's her personal war chest. She uses it for anything she wants with no board approval, claiming it's a contingency. Like hiring a surveyor to trespass on my property, I said, the pieces clicking into place. Precisely, Sarah confirmed. Or paying the HOA's lawyer, who is a personal friend of hers, a monthly retainer that is double the market rate to write threatening letters to residents. The rest of the board just rubber stamps her reports. They're either too intimidated or too lazy to question anything. For the next 2 hours, Sarah gave me a master class in the HOA's corrupt finances. She told me what to look for, how Karen disguised personal expenditures as a legitimate HOA business. Look for payments to vendors with no corresponding invoice. Look for legal fees that don't specify a case or purpose. She paid for a community appreciation dinner last year that was actually a private party for her and her friends, charged to the Community Enhancement Fund. I went home that afternoon with the flash drive and the passwords. That night I logged in. It was all there, just as Sarah had described. The accounting software was a mess of poorly categorized expenses and vague descriptions. But with Sarah's guidance, I knew where to dig. I found the payment to Precision Surveying Incorporated for $3,500, categorized under landscaping contingency. There was no invoice attached, just a memo that read, boundary clarification. I found the monthly retainer payments to Karen's lawyer friend, totaling over $30,000 a year, a staggering sum for an HOA of this size. I found charges for printing services from a company that I discovered, with a quick Google search, was owned by Karen's brother-in-law. The prices were nearly triple the industry standard. It was a cesspool of cronyism and fraud, all funded by the residents she was terrorizing. I spent the next week working late into the night, cross-referencing bank statements with the pathetic excuse for a budget. I downloaded every statement, every transaction record, every report. I built spreadsheets, charts, and graphs. The military engineer in me took over, turning the chaotic financial data into a clear, undeniable picture of corruption. The Community Enhancement Fund was a black hole. Over the past 3 years, nearly $100,000 had been funneled through it with little to no legitimate documentation. It was the fund she used to pay for the surveyor, the overpriced lawyer, the constant stream of violation letters printed by her relative. The residents of Whispering Pines weren't just being ruled by a tyrant, they were paying for the privilege. They were funding their own oppression. I now had the murder weapon. The financial records were irrefutable proof of her malfeasance. Combined with the stories from Dave and the Millers, and my own evidence of her extra-jurisdictional harassment, the case was airtight. The annual meeting was in 3 weeks. It was time to stop gathering intelligence and start planning the final assault. With the financial evidence secured, the final phase of the operation began, preparing the legal trap. The goal was no longer simply to exonerate myself or to stop the harassment. The goal was a complete and total regime change, executed publicly and decisively at the annual meeting. I met with Ben Carter, my lawyer, and laid everything out on his conference table. My binder, now several inches thick, the poster-sized plat map, the financial spreadsheet Sarah and I had prepared, and the sworn affidavits I had collected from Dave and the Millers. Ben walked around the table, examining each piece of evidence. He picked up the photo of the surveyor's work order, then looked at the corresponding $3,500 charge from the HOA's bank account. A slow, predatory grin spread across his face. "Jack," he said, "this is a prosecutor's dream. You've done 90% of my job for me. She's not just a bully, she's committed textbook financial mismanagement and likely breached her fiduciary duty to the HOA. We don't just have a case, we have a public execution." Our strategy for the meeting was multi-pronged, designed to systematically dismantle Karen's authority and credibility until she had no ground left to stand on. Ben outlined the legal framework. First, or when he said, "You as a non-member will speak during the open forum. You will stick to the facts concerning your property. You present the plat map, the illegal fines, and the evidence of the trespassing surveyor. You establish that she took HOA funds and used them for an illegal operation outside of her jurisdiction. That's Act 1. It isolates her and shows her acting alone, against an outside party. Act 2, he continued, is the internal rebellion. Dave Jensen will then speak. He will bring up the flagpole issue and the letter from the HOA's lawyer that misrepresents federal law. This shows her using HOA funds to suppress the rights of members within the community. Mark Miller follows, presenting the litany of petty fines, showing a pattern of arbitrary and capricious enforcement. This is crucial. It makes it personal for every resident in that room who has ever received a ridiculous violation notice. "And for the finale?" I asked. "Act 3, Ben said, his eyes gleaming, is the kill shot. Sarah Gable, the former treasurer, will not be there. She wants to remain anonymous. Instead, you will present the financial analysis. You're an outsider, but you can frame it as a concerned neighbor who has uncovered serious irregularities that affect the financial health of their community. You present the charts. You show them the black hole of the contingency fund. You show them the payments to her lawyer, her brother-in-law, the surveyor. You show them exactly how their money is being wasted on her personal vendettas." Then came the trap. "After you've laid all this out," Ben instructed, "you don't immediately call for her removal. That's too direct. It lets her frame it as a personal attack. Instead, you propose a motion. You say, in light of the unexpected legal and surveying costs incurred by the board in their dispute with the Blackwood Timber Tract, I propose a special assessment of $20 per household to cover this $3,500 expenditure so as not to deplete the community's emergency reserves." I saw the genius of it immediately. It would force an impossible choice on her. If she accepted the motion, she would be forcing the residents to pay directly for her illegal and failed attempt to harass me. Their anger would be immediate and palpable. If she rejected the motion, she would have to explain where the $3,500 came from. She would have to admit she took it from their general funds, from the contingency slush fund, without their approval. Either way, she was trapped. Once the room is in an uproar over the special assessment, Ben concluded, that's when Dave stands up again. And he says, "I believe a special assessment is premature. I believe the more pressing issue is the clear evidence of financial mismanagement and breach of fiduciary duty. I make a motion for a vote of no confidence and the immediate removal of the entire board of directors, effective immediately." He'll need a second, which Mark Miller will provide. Then it goes to a floor vote. According to their own bylaws, a majority vote of members present at the annual meeting is sufficient to remove the board. It was perfect. It was a legal and procedural masterpiece, using the HOA's own rules against them. It wasn't a messy, emotional confrontation. It was a structured takedown. We spent the next 2 weeks refining the plan. I created a crisp, professional PowerPoint presentation. No frills, just facts. Scanned documents, highlighted figures, direct quotes from the bylaws. We timed each person's speech. We anticipated Karen's likely reactions: denial, outrage, attempts to rule us out of order. Ben coached us on the precise language to use. "Don't use words like stole or lied," he advised. "Use unauthorized expenditure, misrepresentation of facts, breach of fiduciary duty. Let the facts speak for themselves. The colder and more professional you are, the more unhinged she will look by comparison." Dave, Mark, and I met several times to rehearse. The initial nervousness of the Millers gave way to a steely resolve as they practiced their speech. Dave, with his military background, needed no coaching on how to stand his ground. He was born for this. The stage was set, the script was written, the trap was baited. All we had to do was wait for Karen to walk into it. The annual meeting was 1 week away. The week leading up to the annual meeting was thick with a tense, electric calm, like the air before a thunderstorm. My part of the intelligence gathering was done. The PowerPoint was finalized, saved on 3 separate flash drives. The affidavits were signed and notarized. The talking points were memorized. Now it was a waiting game, a test of discipline and nerve. I spent my days on my land, not in a state of anxiety, but one of focused preparation. I walked the fire breaks, checked the growth of the young pines, and felt the solid earth beneath my feet. This land was the reason for the fight. It was my sanctuary, and I had come to realize that protecting it meant I also had to help liberate the people living just beyond its borders. The fight was no longer just for me. It was for the miller's right to plant a garden, for Dave's right to fly his flag, for every resident who had been made to feel small and powerless by one woman's insatiable appetite for control. On the evening before the meeting, my small band of insurgents gathered one last time in my workshop. The poster-sized plat map was tacked to one wall, a silent, powerful witness. We sat around a large table, the mood sober and determined. It felt like a pre-mission briefing. "Remember the plan," I said, my voice low and steady. "I open with the external threat, the attack on my property. That establishes the premise. The board has acted illegally. Dave, you follow up with the internal threat, the attack on members' rights. That makes it personal for everyone in the room. Mark, you provide the chorus of abuses, the pattern of petty tyranny that everyone has experienced. That builds the emotional momentum." I looked at each of them. Then I present the financials and spring the trap with a special assessment motion. That's the turning point. When the room is on our side, angry about the money, that's your cue, Dave. You make the motion to remove the board. Mark, you second it. Then we vote. We stick to the facts. We stay calm. We let Karen implode. Mark Miller was nervously shuffling his note cards. What if she just cuts us off? Rules us out of order? Turns off the microphone? She'll try. Ben Carter had warned us. The key is not to argue with her. You just calmly state, according to Robert's Rules of Order, in Section 11.4 of the HOA bylaws, any member has the right to be heard during the open forum. You have the high ground of procedure. If she shuts you down, she looks like a dictator, and it will only make the residents angrier. I had printed out copies of the relevant bylaw sections for each of us. Ammunition. Dave tapped a finger on the table. I'm ready. I've been waiting 2 years to say my piece. She's not shutting me down. His jaw was set, and I saw the Marine in him, resolute and unyielding. Jessica Miller placed a hand on her husband's arm. We're with you, Jack. All the way. I'm scared, but I'm more angry than I am scared. Someone has to stand up to her. I nodded, feeling a swell of pride in this small coalition. A retired colonel, a retired Marine, a young couple who just wanted to paint their shutters, and a retired accountant working from the shadows. We were David, and Karen's HOA board was our Goliath, propped up by nothing more than apathy and fear. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, replaying the sequence in my head, anticipating contingencies. What if her lawyer was there? Ben had assured me it was unlikely for a routine annual meeting, and even if he was, the facts were the facts. What if her board members created a disruption? We would appeal to the crowd, to the rules, to order. I thought about my career, about the complex engineering projects, the hostile environments, the moments where a single decision could mean success or disaster. This felt like that, a strange civilian echo of a command decision. The objective was clear. Remove a corrupt leader and restore order. The assets were in place. The plan was sound. Success depended on flawless execution. I finally got up and walked out onto my porch. The moon was high, casting a silver light over the tops of my pine trees. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine needles. In the distance, I could see the soft, uniform glow of the streetlights in Whispering Pines. It looked peaceful from here, but I knew that behind those perfectly painted front doors, there was a simmering resentment, a community held hostage. Tomorrow, we would offer them a choice: Continued subjugation or liberation? We were lighting a fuse. I had no doubt there would be an explosion. The only question was who would be left standing in the aftermath. I took a deep breath of the free air on my side of the line and felt a profound sense of resolve. Let the storm come. We were ready. The Whispering Pines Community Clubhouse was exactly as I had imagined it, a symphony in beige. Beige walls, beige carpet, beige folding chairs. At the front of the room on a slightly raised dais sat Karen Miller and her 4 board members. Karen, in a royal blue jacket that did little to soften her sharp edges, presided over the meeting with an air of bored omnipotence. Her cronies, 2 men and 2 women who looked like they had been handpicked for their lack of spine, flanked her like nervous pigeons. The room was about half full with maybe 60 residents, most of whom looked resigned to a long, tedious evening of budget reports and landscaping updates. Dave, the Millers, and I had spaced ourselves out in the audience to appear as separate individuals. The first hour was a masterclass in bureaucratic monotony. The treasurer, one of the spineless men, read a budget summary so vague it was meaningless, full of large, round numbers and no detail. The secretary read the minutes from the last meeting. Karen gave a president's report, a rambling monologue about the importance of property values and the constant vigilance required to maintain them. She made a few veiled references to external threats to our community aesthetic, and I felt a dozen pairs of eyes flicker towards me. My presence had been noted. Finally, she arrived at the last item on the agenda. That concludes the board's reports. We now have a 10-minute period for open forum. Any comments from the floor? Her tone suggested she hoped there would be none. This was it. I stood up. I'd like to make a comment. All eyes swiveled to me. Karen's face tightened, a flicker of annoyance crossing her features. Please state your name for the record. My name is Jack Sterling. A murmur went through the room. They knew the name. Mr. Sterling, Karen said, her voice dripping with condescension. This forum is for members of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. You are not a member. You are correct. I am not a member, I said calmly, my voice filling the quiet room. However, the board, under your direction, has seen fit to engage with me and my property directly, making my situation a matter of HOA business. Specifically, the board has expended HOA funds in its dealings with me. Therefore, I am here to address the membership about the use of their funds. It was a perfectly crafted legal argument. She was cornered. Denying me the right to speak would look like she had something to hide. She glanced at her board members who offered no help. Fine, she snapped. You have 2 minutes. Thank you. I walked to the front of the room and turned to face the residents. I had their full attention. Good evening. As I said, my name is Jack Sterling. I own the 500-acre timber property that borders your community to the west. I unrolled the large plat map and held it up. This is the official, certified county plat map that legally defines the boundaries of Whispering Pines. As you can see, my property, the Blackwood Timber Tract, is explicitly not a part of this plat. Your HOA's authority and its covenants end at this line. I then pulled out the stack of fines. Despite this clear legal boundary, your HOA president, Ms. Miller, has sent me a series of fines totaling nearly $3,000 for alleged violations on my private land. Fines for unapproved landscaping, visual pollution, and improper land use. These fines are illegal and unenforceable. The murmuring grew louder. I held up the photo of the surveyor's work order. Furthermore, Ms. Miller, using your HOA funds, hired a surveyor to trespass on my property to stake a fraudulent community access easement. This action was not only illegal, it exposed your HOA to significant legal liability. Karen stood up, her face crimson. That is enough. You are out of order. This is a private HOA matter. I am discussing the expenditure of HOA funds, which is a matter for the members, I said, not raising my voice, not even looking at her, keeping my focus on the audience. The surveyor's invoice was for $3,500, money that came from your dues. A gasp went through the room. I had landed the first blow. My time is up, I said, and walked back to my seat. Before Karen could regain control, Dave Jensen stood up. I have a comment. Karen pointed a trembling finger at him. Dave, we all know about your flagpole. No, ma'am, you don't, Dave said, his voice ringing with authority. You know you've been fining me, but what these people don't know is that you had the HOA's lawyer send me this letter. He held it up. A letter that misrepresents federal law in an attempt to intimidate me into giving up my right to fly the flag of my country. How much of our money did you pay that lawyer to write this threatening, legally false letter, Karen? The room was electric. This was no longer about an outsider. This was one of their own. Mark Miller stood up next. And how much did it cost to fine us because our shutters were the wrong shade of beige? Or because my son left his bike out? How much are we paying in administrative costs for this board to harass us over nonsense? The dam had broken. Several other residents stood up, all shouting at once, their own stories of petty fines and harassment pouring out. Karen was banging her gavel, screaming for order, but no one was listening. Her authority had vanished. Into the chaos, I stood up one more time. A point of order! I boomed, the old command voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent. A motion is on the floor, I lied, knowing there wasn't one, but seizing the moment. I walked back to the front and put my final PowerPoint slide on the projector screen. It was a simple pie chart showing the contingency fund and how it had been spent. The question, I said, pointing to the screen, is about these unauthorized expenditures. The $3,500 for the surveyor, the $30,000 annual retainer for the lawyer, the payments to a printing company owned by Ms. Miller's relative. This is your money. In light of the $3,500 spent on the survey of my land, I moved that a special assessment of $20 per household be levied to cover this cost and replenish the community's funds. The room exploded. No, someone yelled. She spent it. She can pay for it. I'm not paying for her mistake, another shouted. The trap had been sprung. They were furious, not at me, but at her. Into the pandemonium, Dave Jensen stood on a chair. A substitute motion, he yelled. I move for a vote of no confidence in the immediate removal of the entire board of directors for gross financial mismanagement and breach of fiduciary duty. Mark Miller jumped up. I second the motion. Karen's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. She was speechless. There is a motion on the floor, and it has been seconded, Dave bellowed. All in favor of removing the board say, aye. A deafening roar of aye shook the beige room. All opposed? The silence was absolute. Not even Karen's cronies dared to speak. Dave pointed a finger at the board. The motion carries. You are removed. Please vacate the dais. For a moment, Karen just stood there, frozen. Then, with a strangled sob, she grabbed her purse and fled the room, her cronies scrambling after her like rats from a sinking ship. The room erupted in applause and cheers. It was over. We had won. The immediate aftermath of the vote was a scene of cathartic chaos. People were hugging, shaking hands, and laughing with a sense of giddy relief. The oppressive weight that had hung over the community for years had been lifted in a single decisive moment. Dave Jensen, still standing on his chair, called for order. All right, everyone. We've done the hard part, but now we have to govern. According to the bylaws, we need to elect an interim board to serve until a special election can be held. One of the residents, a woman who had tearfully recounted being fined because her wind chimes were too noisy, immediately shouted, I nominate Dave Jensen for president. A chorus of second filled the room. Then another voice, I nominate Mark Miller for the board. And another, I nominate Jessica Miller for treasurer. She's an accountant. My name was called out as well. I stood up and politely declined. My work here is done, I said with a smile. This community needs to be run by its members. I'm just the neighbor. An interim board was formed right then and there, with Dave at the helm and the Millers taking key roles. Their first official act, proposed by Dave, was a unanimous vote to formally rescind every fine issued by the previous board in the last 2 years. The second was to draft a formal written apology to me, to be delivered by the new board in person, and to void all illegal claims and fines against the Blackwood Timber Tract. The third motion was to hire an independent forensic accountant to conduct a full audit of the HOA's finances and to authorize legal action against Karen Miller and any other culpable board members to recoup the misused funds. The liberation was complete. The next morning, As I was enjoying my coffee on the porch, a different kind of golf cart came up my driveway. It was Dave with Mark and Jessica Miller. Dave was holding a framed document. "On behalf of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association," he said with mock solemnity, "we present you with this official apology. And also this." He handed me a gift card to the local steakhouse, a small token of our immense gratitude. "Not necessary," I said, though I was deeply moved. "But thank you. How does it feel to be in charge?" Dave grinned. "Terrifying and wonderful. We spent half the night going through the old files. It's worse than we thought. She had a file on everyone. But the first thing I did this morning," he said, his eyes twinkling, "was go to the storage shed and get this." He reached into the back of the golf cart and pulled out a 25-foot flagpole. "It's going up this afternoon, and I'm sending Karen a photo." We all laughed. The change was palpable. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose and community. In the weeks that followed, the new board worked tirelessly. They rewrote the most nonsensical and oppressive rules. The approved color palette for shutters was expanded to include a veritable rainbow of beiges. The rule about garage doors was abolished. The community garden was reestablished. They fired Karen's lawyer friend and hired a reputable firm at half the cost. The forensic audit revealed that Karen had misappropriated over $70,000 in HOA funds over her 3-year tenure. The HOA filed a civil suit against her, and the local district attorney's office, prompted by the audit's findings, opened a criminal investigation for embezzlement. Karen's downfall was swift and total. Forced to sell her home to cover her legal fees, she left the community in disgrace. The last I heard, she was living in a small apartment across town, her empire of beige reduced to a few hundred square feet. Her name became a cautionary tale, a whispered legend in the neighborhood about the dangers of unchecked power. Life returned to a new, better normal. The relationship between my timber tract and Whispering Pines was no longer adversarial. It was symbiotic. Dave and the new board worked with me to create a small, designated nature trail along the very edge of my property, with my explicit, written permission, of course, that respected the boundary and allowed residents to appreciate the forest without disturbing it. Kids from the neighborhood would sometimes ask me questions about the trees and the animals, and I found I enjoyed being the resident woodsman. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a year after the infamous meeting, I was conducting another controlled burn, a small one to clear out some undergrowth. It was a perfect day for it, with a light breeze blowing the smoke away from the subdivision. I saw a golf cart approaching, and for a split second, my old instincts kicked in. But it was just Dave. He pulled up, got out, and handed me a cold bottle of water. "Looks good, Jack," he said, nodding at the slow, healthy fire. "Doing good work." We stood there for a moment, watching the flames. His American flag was visible over the rooftops in the distance, flying proud and free. The Miller's house was now a slightly different, unapproved, and beautiful shade of tan. The community was healing. It was thriving. Later that evening, I went into my office and took the Operation Whispering Pines binder from the shelf. It was thick with the history of the war, Karen's arrogant letters, the illegal fines, the photos of the surveyor, the financial spreadsheets, the meeting agenda, the notarized affidavits. It was a monument to a victory won not with force, but with facts, discipline, and the courage of ordinary people. I carried it out to my workshop, to the industrial-grade wood chipper I used for clearing brush. One by one, I fed the pages into its hungry maw. Karen's signature, the lawyer's letter, the financial statements. They were all shredded into confetti, then into mulch. I took the bag of shredded paper, the last remnants of Karen's reign of terror, and spread it at the base of a stand of young longleaf pines. Their war was over. Now they could just grow. The mulch from the battle would nourish the very trees she had tried to control. Justice, in its own organic way, had been served. And my 500 acres of heaven were finally at peace.